The Tories are desperate for us all to move on from complaints about Dominic Cummings breaking the lockdown. The problem for them? The public don't seem to want to play ball. To talk about the Dominic Cummings row, its political implications, and also, the extent to which it might undermine the lockdown, I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Dalia Gebrial and Owen Jones. How are you both doing?
Hi.
Very well.
Not bad. Sun is shining. Cummings is going under. Great day.
Well, is he going under? I suppose that's the question we're going to be addressing today. First of all, if you want to share your thoughts about this show, go to the hashtag or tweet on the hashtag Tisky Sour. Share this link to get more people watching this live. We're going to go through, all the elements of this Cummings row, public opinion, whether we'll see a Tory revolt beyond sort of polite letters to constituents, and also some of the sort of bizarre defences that we've seen from the likes of Michael Gove out on television. But I want to start with what's really the big news story of the day when it comes to the Cummings row and the government, which was Boris Johnson sitting for 90 minutes in front of the liaison committee in Parliament. The liaison committee, I hadn't heard of it either. It's when the chairs of all the various select committees, they have a chance to get together and ask the Prime Minister various questions about their policy agenda. This was the first chance that any MPs had to put Boris Johnson under any scrutiny about the Dominic Cummings affair. So it was quite well built up. It played on the BBC One, which is very rare for something as esoteric as a parliamentary select committee. Wasn't quite the blockbuster we would have hoped for. But to get an idea of what went down, here's a clip of Yvette Cooper, who is chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, asking Johnson a question which relates to Dominic Cummings breaking the lockdown. Let's take a look.
Your instructions now to parents who either have COVID or have the symptoms of COVID, who won't know how seriously they're going to get it, and who have no local childcare available. Is the message to those parents now the one from Jenny Harries to stay at home unless there's a risk to life, and if you do get ill, contact the community hubs? Or is it the message from the Transport Secretary and the Communities Secretary to be able to travel to wherever you have a support network? In the words of Robert Jenrick this morning, if you don't have ready access to childcare, then you can do as Dominic Cummings did. Which is it?
Well, I'm not certain, Yvette, that there's as much of a discrepancy between those two bits of advice as you suggest. And I think what Jenny was trying to say was that if you've got exceptional difficulties with childcare, then you should take account of them.
What Jenny was trying to say, this is a Prime Minister who, for the last 3 months or so, has been saying, I follow the science. There he is. He has a scientist's word spoken back to him, Jenny Harries, who's Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And he says, I think she meant to say something else. That's not following the science. That's literally refashioning history. So the scientist said something which is less politically awkward for you. Jenny Harries said, you only get to leave your home if there's a serious risk to life. And he said, actually, no, what she actually meant was if there's any kind of exceptional circumstance, then you get to do it. So I'm calling that strategy one of which Johnson deployed in the committee, which was to sort of ignore the premise of the question and to basically say complete untruths. Let's look at Cooper's follow-up, and we'll see Johnson's second method of avoiding scrutiny.
So if you are trying to tackle local outbreaks and prevent them spreading, you need to be giving clear advice to parents.
Yeah.
And what is it? Because it is not clear to me from listening to Jenny Harries and to Robert Jenrick what that advice to parents who are in Dominic Cummings' situation.
The clear advice is to stay at home unless you absolutely have to go to work to do your job. If you have exceptional problems with childcare, then that may cause you to vary your arrangements, and that's clear. We're also saying from tomorrow that, and this is an important development, that there is a new test and trace operation which will change people's lives and which will require a great deal of thought and compliance, but which I think will be worth it for the whole nation. And the fundamental advice remains absolutely unchanged, which is wash your hands, observe social distancing, and self-isolate if you have symptoms.
Strategy 1 is to lie. Strategy 2 is to avoid, just to change the subject. I mean, Owen, I know you were glued to this liaison committee. It was pretty goddamn frustrating to watch, wasn't it?
Right, I mean, it was a farce, an absolute farce. It was bluster, it was deflection, it was dishonesty, it was an abject failure to answer any of the questions, the most basic fundamental questions put to him. In a nutshell, it was vintage Boris Johnson. I mean, on this whole, the trace and test system, it's just been reported to Sky News that one insider in the trace and test system says that contact tracing at their level won't go live tomorrow. They can't input or receive data yet. They won't start phone calls till next week. So this entire system is not ready to go in any shape or form whatsoever. And indeed, the fundamental problem, as many of the politicians, Yvette Cooper amongst them, pointed out, is obviously with the whole farce, including Dominic Cummings, where the government now is rewriting rules in hindsight and muddying their own advice, which underpins a public health approach to save the lives of thousands of people. And we already know that tens of thousands of people have already needlessly died because this country belatedly went into lockdown when we had more estimated infections than any major European country. That's why we've got the worst death rate in Europe. That Dominic Cummings' own what Dominic Cummings did, which is so disastrous, isn't just the anger, the fury that he's caused amongst people who haven't been able to go to funerals of loved ones, who haven't been able to hold the hands of their loved ones as they died, who haven't been able to see those they love. And we could go on, the sacrifices millions of people have had to make. But the whole point, particularly as we move to a trace and test system, is that people or have regional lockdowns, is people have to abide strictly by the advice that's given to them. That is now a coach and horses have been driven through that. And now, indeed, what Boris Johnson couldn't do, and this was the crux of his confrontation with Yvette Cooper, he couldn't give advice, any clear advice, about what a parent with coronavirus who was struggling with childcare, and the polling Yvette Cooper referred to showed that millions of people in that situation, that if they get coronavirus, he couldn't give any advice because any clear advice would contradict what his own advisor did. So that just sums up the mess that we're now in. As it is, the stay alert slogan itself is, of course, means absolutely nothing to the majority of people in this country. But by Dominic Cummings' own actions, the government are no longer able to offer answer even the most rudimentary questions, because that would involve exposing the fact that Dominic Cummings broke the rules and needs to resign.
It should really be now stay alert, find a loophole, right? I mean, that's the example they have set for us. Before I go to you, actually, Dalia, I'm just going to show one clip of Matt Hancock today, who, when he was announcing the rollout of the test and trace system tomorrow, which, as Owen's pointed out, might be more PR than an actual public health program, at least at this stage. He sort of explained it in a way which I thought demonstrated so clearly how damaging this Cummings row is, and, well, their failure to basically say he has done wrong and he should face the consequences. Let's take a look at Matt Hancock about 2 hours ago.
And the instructions to people are clear. If you get symptoms, isolate immediately and get a test. If you are contacted by NHS Test and Trace instructing you to isolate, you must. It is your civic duty. So you avoid unknowingly spreading the virus, and you help to break the chain of transmission. This will be voluntary at first because we trust everyone to do the right thing. But we can quickly make it mandatory if that's what it takes.
So, I mean, I'm going to go to you for this, Dalia, but I mean, I just find it phenomenal that the same guy who yesterday was saying that someone who found a loophole in the rules, which meant that they could drive 270 miles, even though they had symptoms for coronavirus, is now telling people that if you get a call to say you've been in contact with someone with coronavirus, it is your civic duty to stay in your house for 14 days, and that he trusts us to be responsible, unlike his boss. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Dalia, how are you finding watching all of these complete frauds sort of get up one day and tell us one thing and then stand up and say the complete opposite thing just a few hours later?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly frustrating. It has been frustrating, not just throughout the coronavirus crisis, but through the entirety of the Vote Leave campaign, of Boris's premiership. And for me, the worrying thing here is not whether or not Dominic Cummings is a liar, or whether or not Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings believe that there's one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. We know that's not news to anyone. That is at the heart of the ideology of Tories like Cummings and Boris Johnson. For me, what I am so concerned about is the impact that this might have in terms of creating a second spike, because there are two really concrete, crucial parts of any successful public health messaging issue. Like the 101 of public health messaging is A, clarity, and B, accountability. And that is something that this government has failed on so monumentally that we are left now with being one of the most developed economies in the entire world with the second highest death rate. So for me, this is just going to accelerate that issue, because what they have done is they've confused people, thereby violating clarity, which is a hallmark of good public health messaging. And they have also shown that if you're rich enough, if you are sort of, if you consider yourself to be above the law in this way, if you can find a loophole, then the accountability processes are just not there. And when it comes to this contact track and trace and test issue, once again, what we have seen from this government over and over again is a level of incompetence that genuinely boggles my mind. And what I am seeing now when it comes to this trace and test issue is I just don't trust that the level of competence, the level of organization that is required to roll something like this out is going to be present in this government. So for me, whether or not Cummings has any integrity, whether or not Boris Johnson is willing to throw public health under the bus to save his mate, that's not really the news for me. What is absolutely so concerning to me is the fact that this massive public undermining of the guidance will just make it so much harder to get people to comply by the rules, especially because what is so specific about this coronavirus crisis is that if you personally feel, I'm young, I don't have any underlying health conditions, I'm probably going to be fine, then that can give you a sense of impunity that will then put the most vulnerable at risk. So for me, that is the real takeaway and the real worry for me with the events that have unfolded over the past week. And we know that from the Mumsnet data that Yvette Cooper referred to, that more parents are now feel that since Cummings has gotten away with this and since the government have completely absolved him of this, that they would be more likely to break the lockdown guidance in order to have access to childcare, which defeats the whole purpose of all of the sacrifices that we've made over the past 2 months.
So Dalia, it might be not unusual that you have no trust in this Conservative government and don't believe a word Boris Johnson says, but the level of unanimity, the whole country agrees with you this time around, that might not, that's a bit more exceptional. That's what we're going to talk about in one moment. Public opinion on this. First of all, we've got almost 2,500 of you watching. Let's try and get to 3,000 tonight. And I'm going to read one comment as well. Michael Deary with £10 super chat. Maybe I'm giving them too much Machiavellian credit, but does the government want us to move on? The more we talk about Cummings, the less we talk about the 60,000 dead. Actually, Owen, quick fire on that.
Well, I think it all slots together. I actually think what's happened is at the opening stages of this crisis, a syndrome kicked in of rally around the pilot while the plane is crashing. We can't ask tough questions now because we're in the midst of a national catastrophe and we don't want to undermine strategy to combat it. That was always soft because the polling showed that a large majority always thought we went into lockdown too late. We did. Always thought the government failed on testing. They have. Always thought the government failed on PPE. They have. Always thought the government failed on care homes. They did. But there was that sense that you've got to rally around, like in a war, a national emergency, which is what we've gone through. That was already dissipating because we have the worst death toll in Europe. We've surpassed now the official per capita deaths of Italy. We're fast catching up there with Spain, and we're set to overtake them. We have excess deaths now, which amount to 1 in every 1,000 Britons dying in this pandemic in the space of a few weeks. And people have realised that's because of the government's own failure. So I think this is going to meld with that. People see increasingly it's become acceptable. People have felt more comfortable being able to question what the government have done. And at the same time, they're linking that with the general shambolic incompetence, which is epitomised by Dominic Cummings, the co-prime minister, effectively feeling that rules don't apply to him. He doesn't take them seriously because he's powerful and he's special. The plebs, different rules apply to them. Undermining, again, a public health strategy which was always flawed from the very start. And I think people they will work backwards. They would go, so hold on a minute. They designed these rules which they flouted themselves. Government ministers have defended that flouting is acceptable, rewritten the rules in hindsight, and they messed up in this crisis and thousands died as a consequence. I think they're melding together. And I think that is why this is so profound as a crisis for the government, because it will mean people will feel far less defensive about saying, which was what the government wanted them to do, which is to go, hold on, guys, this is an extraordinary set of circumstances. Any government would struggle. Of course, mistakes will be made. How could they not? How could we ever really plan for something like this? That is evaporating, and people are showing both contempt and fury for the government for those two reasons, which are linking together.
Yeah, and I mean that's not hypothetical. There's some very hard evidence for what Owen Jones has just said. So Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, actually, their strategy in response to this crisis was clearly, like what they did in the general election and like what they did with Brexit, was to say all of these criticisms, they're coming from left-wing bitter Remainers, from the Daily Mirror and the Guardian. What people should do is listen to what Dominic Cummings said and make up their own mind. So that was part of their strategy. They'll say, we'll put it all out in the open. We'll dismiss our critics as politically motivated and hope that saves it for us. The problem, it has categorically not worked. So there was a great poll in the Daily Mail this morning. We're going to go to some of the very extensive stats in there, but sort of the headline figures. 66% of the public think Cummings should resign, and 80% think he broke the lockdown rules. So when you have Boris Johnson up there, standing up there and saying he didn't break the rules, it was perfectly a reasonable thing to do in an exceptional circumstance, even though it wasn't remotely exceptional. If you're watching that thinking, how can this guy be just gaslighting me, lying to me like this? Don't worry, because 80% of the public are thinking exactly the same thing. It's kind of really brought the country together. Also, that press conference which he gave in the Rose Garden, sort of sitting at that sort of pop-up table, telling us his perspective on the events. The word that people said most often to describe that was arrogant. So 59% of people who were asked how Dominic Cummings came across, arrogant. That was and to a 3-1 margin, they think Johnson is defending him because he is his top aide, not because he genuinely believes he is innocent. So people really waking up to the cynicism of Boris Johnson. I want to go to my favorite bit of the poll, though, because we talked in depth about Dominic Cummings' sort of ridiculous statement and his ridiculous account of the events which he thought exonerated him. And what's great in this poll is that every single claim that Dominic Cummings made, the country has seen through, every single one. So let's get up some of these. So the pollsters ask whether Cummings, there's a number of them, we'll get to this. Do you believe Dominic Cummings had to drive to Durham to get childcare help? True, only 25% and only 40% of Tory voters. False, 61% and 47% of Tory voters. So they were trying to make this criticism, this is just bitter Remainers and bitter Corbynites criticising Dominic Cummings. Everyone in the country, a majority, all demographics, all political persuasions, they think he is lying. They don't think he had to go to Durham to get childcare help. Let's go to the next one. Feared protesters would attack his London home. You've got to remember this was his key justification for why he had to go. True, 23%. False, 59%. It gets even more overwhelming. Drove to Barnard Castle to check eyesight before driving back to London. True, 8%. False, 78%. So that was the largest disbelief, and that's, I think, the most memorable part of that story. And the final one: left the car and sat on a bench at Barnard Castle because he felt sick. True, 16%. False, 66%. And then there was a general question: is he telling the truth overall or not? Yes, 17%. No, 66%. So I mean, that conference, I'll go to you, Dalia, that press conference of him sitting in the garden, where what he thought would happen was that he would put aside his side of the story and people would think, oh yeah, that does seem kind of reasonable. Maybe it is reasonable to drive to Barnard Castle because you've got bad eyesight. And maybe it is reasonable. Maybe I am exceptional because a newspaper wrote a bad thing about me and then someone said something bad about me on Twitter and that meant I had to leave my London home. Like, how did he call it this wrong?
Yeah, I mean, it's been pretty sort of shocking to watch. And I think it's because someone like Dominic Cummings has sort of never had to really be held to account in this way. And I was very surprised, actually, when he decided to do that press conference, just because I think he's so often the kind of person behind the scenes who's kind of pulling the strings and running the campaign from behind the scenes. I always thought that he wasn't very much of a front of house guy. But I think he, got ahead of himself, decided to go for it, and it absolutely just blew up in his face. But to kind of go to the polling, which is just kind of showing that I think people are becoming really aware of two things. First of all, that gaslighting is at the absolute heart of this government strategy when dealing with coronavirus. They keep making explicit errors and then going back and saying, we never did that. What you saw, you didn't ever see it. What you experienced was something that you never experienced. And for me, things like the care home situation was it's like, we know that our elderly relatives are dying. We know that they're dying because people have been allowed to go back into care homes after being discharged from hospital, and not being checked for coronavirus, and not having guidance adequately followed. And then to have the government standing up and with such confidence saying, we wanted to put a safety net around care homes. It's this kind of consistent, but this isn't just kind of like picking apart policies. This isn't stuff that's happening in the shadows. These are deaths, and this is an illness and deaths that are happening that now we're quickly, huge parts of the British population are being touched by it in some way. You mentioned that figure earlier, that 1 in 1,000 people, 1 in 1,000 Britons now, when it comes to excess deaths, are dying. So this is becoming something that people are being directly touched by, and then they are being gaslit by the government. And this is going to happen again with schools. The school situation is a ticking time bomb. But when it comes to the kind of question of clarity as well, I think another reason why this government is so poor at just being straightforward, it's not just about the fact that they rely on this idea of, if things go tits up, we're just going to, try and, gaslight people and use the machinery of the media that has been so soft on us for so long in order to carry that out. But I also think it's because the government is just so shockingly out of touch that even for me, as someone who's kind of knee deep in politics, it still shocks me every day. So with the liaison committee today, you had to see an MP explaining to Boris Johnson that people who have leave to remain can't access government funds because of the no recourse to public funds law, which, the idea that Boris Johnson doesn't understand that exists is so shocking to me, because this isn't some nitty gritty policy issue. This is a foundational pillar of the Tories government, particularly since as part of the hostile environment ramped up by Theresa May. How could you, and this is something that has made people's lives a living hell. How could you, as the Tory Prime Minister, not only not know that is the case, but not understand how a major policy like that is going to massively shape how people experience this virus? So I think the lack of clarity is partly cynical, a big part, that we want to kind of strategize our words to make sure that we're just about slippery enough that you can't pin anything on us. But I also think it comes from genuine lack of understanding and lack of knowledge and lack of, people are saying that something that I see a lot of the time is that we should actually view this through a failed state lens, through the idea that actually the capacity to adequately address this virus when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to infrastructure, is actually just not there right now. So I think this question of whether or not this is one gaslight too far is really going to determine how this unfolds and what kind of lasting damage this might have on Boris's government.
I want to focus or throw back to you, Owen, this question of what were they thinking? Because one of the things I thought today watching the liaison committee, yes, Boris Johnson was deeply unimpressive, and it was appalling that he didn't know that there was a policy called no recourse to public funds, whereby people who have leave to remain can't access benefits. Bizarre. But what was lucky for Boris Johnson is the format of it was so boring. Like, I was really struggling to pay attention. It just looked dull. It was very procedural. Whereas what Dominic Cummings speaking in the Rose Garden, they had managed to make a really bad news story for them into like blockbuster TV, like because of the novelty of it. It was really exciting. Like, I mean, maybe exciting is going, maybe, I'm just a nerd. I found it exciting. Okay. So having him there sort of telling his story, and then the journalist sort of standing up and asking him to and fro questions. I mean, what were they thinking? Or why, if you've got a really bad story with loads of holes in it and none of it is remotely relatable, would you decide I'm going to make an hour-long speech to the public and then let journalists ask me questions about it? I mean, it's clearly gone very wrong, but how did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, just quickly on no recourse to public funds, I'm not that shocked that they're not necessarily aware, particularly Boris Johnson, not details man, I suppose, as I think even his strongest champions would say, aren't aware about the finer details of the violence they impose on people, particularly migrants, purely, as we know, as a political strategy over the last few years to try and whip up and incite bigotry to deflect anger away from those at the top, particularly those who bankroll the Conservative Party. In terms of Dominic Cummings and the Rose Garden, look, they obviously had a strategy. I mean, let's try and at least attempt to kind of dissect the internal workings of their minds. What he was trying to do in that particular kind of dramatic moment was to bog us down in the granular details, and because obviously objectively he broke the rules, everything else is noise, but that was an attempt at generating noise. It was an attempt to say that we should end up wrapping ourselves up in knots over why did he leave at that moment, what was the reason he had to go, and that we'd end up nitpicking. That was the attempt. And I think a lot of it is hubris. This is a guy who was the main character of a BBC drama featuring his successful attempts to win a referendum in which the odds were overwhelmingly, it seemed, that Remain would win. Almost every single newspaper commentator in the country thought Remain were going to win, whichever side they backed. This is someone who was seen as a key architect of a Conservative majority, which, if we're going to be brutally honest, very few people thought would be an 80-seat majority. And I think he's just drunk on his own hubris. I also think, and it was quite a striking quote in the Financial Times, a friend of Dominic Cummings was quoted as saying he doesn't care what happens to the Tories. He's not a Conservative. He has no political attachment. The quote said he didn't care if they sank below the Greens. And I think a lot of it is it's his own affronted ego. It's the fact Boris Johnson himself feels so reliant, because he's so weak, so reliant on this one advisor, that he's allowed Dominic Cummings essentially to, I would imagine Dominic Cummings' call, any rational prime minister would have said, don't do that. That will obviously make things worse. But Dominic Cummings himself, his hurt ego, meant that he almost, and his sense of hubris, the sense that he's the architect of these spectacular, against all odds, victories. I mean, I think the evidence that points to that, by the way, that's just pure egomania on his part, is, I think we're going to mention it, the fact that in that press conference, he declared that he had predicted a pandemic, that a pandemic could happen, and he did that last year. And what's been discovered since is he edited his blogs on the first day he came back from Durham to insert that in those blogs. And the reason he did that, and he made this clear in the press conference, is he was so angry at being, by the Sunday Times incidentally, for being accused of being the key promoter of herd immunity, including a strategy of protect the economy, let older people die, which is how the Sunday Times sources summed it up, that he felt he had to actually amend his blogs in a completely dishonest way to make it look like not only did he not push herd immunity, he was the only guy in the room who thought this was going to happen. One of the only people in the country who thought this was going to happen. Now, that was a lie. That was completely dishonest and is an example of why we can't trust anything he says. But it is testament to his own burdened ego, hurt ego. So I think it's those three things. A bruised ego of someone who genuinely thinks he's an evil mastermind. I think he relishes being seen as an evil mastermind. Someone who thinks, well, I'm essentially a magician.
Oh, I think we've lost Owen in a sort of great pose, actually. Hopefully he'll come together.
Oh wow!
Hopefully we'll get him back soon. Have we got you back now?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, we do. Great. You froze with sort of like your mouth open and your face leant forward.
A prime minister who feels so dependent on him. There's those three elements. I don't know if that came through.
We are going to move on to a slightly different element of this story, which comes from that same poll. So also contained in that Daily Mail poll was a figure that 65% of the public believe the conduct of Dominic Cummings will make people less likely to follow the lockdown rules. And we've already got some anecdotal evidence to prove that. So let's get up a tweet from a London anaesthetist, so someone working in the NHS, a doctor. They tweeted, "I've now had 3 people tell me in the last 24 hours that they have broken lockdown, citing Dominic Cummings as justification. His resignation is genuinely required as an urgent and powerful public health intervention. People are flouting the rules because he did without consequence." So that's from the medical profession. We can also get someone who is from law enforcement, so a copper. So this London police officer also phoned LBC to tell his experience when he approaches members of the public who are breaking lockdown since this whole Dominic Cummings row started. Let's have a listen to that now.
But a good sort of half a dozen people I spoke to today, when I've said to them, well, why do you say that? Why do you say lockdown is over? And they say, oh, well, government can do what they want. And as a police officer, I don't know what to respond back to them. I don't know. We don't speak for government. We just enforce the rules. And I don't know what the answer we're meant to give back is.
So you absolutely have come across people.
Really, really difficult.
Yeah, you're saying that you absolutely have come across people that have used what has happened over the last weekend as an excuse not to follow the lockdown rules.
There are 3 people who have said that to me today. There are 3 separate groups of people who have said to me today, well, if Dominic Cummings can do what he wants, I actually think 2 people specifically said him. One person said the government, by which I automatically assume he's talking about this, can do what they want, then we should be able to too. So why are you bullying me, Mr. Officer, is kind of along the lines of the conversations that I've had today.
I mean, I'll go to you, Dalia. I mean, this government are used to having doctors against them. They normally have coppers on side. I mean, have they lost a loyal base there in terms of law enforcement who is saying, because your guy's broken the rules, we can't do our job properly anymore?
Yeah, I mean, but once again, this is sort of not the first time that, you would have thought that, given that sort of law and order is such a core part of Tory messaging or right-wing messaging, that you think that sort of seeing high-profile Conservatives breaking their own kind of laws and their own rules and their own principles, that doesn't tend to have the kind of impact that you would expect it to have. And that I think people, they always manage to find a way to weasel themselves out of it. But I think what is so bizarre about this situation, which was sort of as Owen was discussing, was that on the one hand, we have this portrayal of Cummings as being this incredible strategic mastermind, who kind of single-handedly took on the establishment and won Brexit. But at the same time, how could he be both such a strategic mastermind, but then also be so profoundly stupid as to have a whole public messaging thing that relies on individual common sense, and within that talk about driving hundreds of miles in order to test his eyesight. So I guess for me, what this has told me is that actually a lot of Dominic Cummings' wins are not so much because of Dominic Cummings, but are because of the huge amount of resources that he has been able to leverage. I watched a lecture that he did. I actually watched it a while ago because I was just curious about this sort of like weird little man. And he sort of talked about how he was approached to do the Vote Leave campaign. And, he just sort of like would very, very casually just sort of be like, yeah, a few billionaires sort of said that they'll throw like X amount of money behind it. And I kind of think, well, if any of us had that number of resources, then, I just think that maybe we overstate this kind of like genius of Dominic Cummings. And that is really highlighted by the fact that Rose Garden press conference was possibly one of the worst pieces of PR I've ever seen in my life. But it really does raise the question, because in other governments and also in this government, whenever a high profile figure has publicly broken the lockdown, they have been immediately sacked. For me, this raises the question of what kind of power does Dominic Cummings hold over not just Boris Johnson, but also, the circle around Boris Johnson have rallied quite tightly around him. What kind of power does he leverage that he is able to flout the rules in this way, but also take on his own PR strategy that has been an absolute disaster, and still it looks like might not be held accountable? But once again, as I sort of mentioned before, for me, the absolutely worrying part of this is not even about Dominic Cummings or Boris Johnson himself. I know who they are. They've showed who they are throughout their career. It is the public health impact that this is going to have, which will result in more deaths amongst the most vulnerable. That is the key issue right now. And that is but I don't expect the government to take the measures necessary, because it seems that PR rather than public health is the primary, mission of this government. And if it intersects with public health, great. If it goes against public health, well, that's just how it is as far as they're concerned.
We're going to pick up some of those points later, especially that idea of what does Dominic Cummings have over Boris Johnson that means he's expending quite this much political capital on protecting him. We're going to talk about a slightly lighter story next, which is the Tories are now a joke. They clearly are. And there's some cultural content now to prove it. But before I do that, there's 3,100 of you watching. And Kaz Mahoney with a £2 super chat says, smash the like button. So listen to Kaz. As many of you 3,000 as possible should be hitting that like button. It doesn't cost you anything and it helps with the algorithm. But as well as hitting like, my biggest ask to you is for new viewers to hit the subscribe button, because I want to get up to 100,000 by the end of the summer. And especially if you're new to this show, it'll mean that you get updates. We go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 p.m. And Aaron has a brilliant show every Tuesday at 8 p.m. So loads of content for you if you hit that subscribe button. So we've just discussed a police officer who was saying that the Conservative government have made it harder for them to enforce the lockdown rules. And we've also talked about how Dominic Cummings' strategy, his plan, seems to have backfired. Maybe he's not the strategic genius that he thought he was. And yeah, we are now seeing this same idea getting picked up from some fairly unlikely sources. So we've never done this before, but we are going to show you the front page of this morning's Daily Star. So can we get that up? So it says, cops, don't drive if you're blind. Shock new advice for Britain's ruling elite. And then the paper comes with a free do whatever the hell you want and sod everybody else mask. The cop story is a reference to ex-Greater Manchester Police Chief Constable Sir Peter Fahey saying Cummings would have been turned back if officers had pulled him over. That's an ex-Manchester Chief Constable. Boris Johnson saying what he's done is completely reasonable. He's saying we would have pulled over this guy. I mean, anyone who is driving in the middle of a lockdown to test their eyes, we'd have pulled, it's not a normal thing that he did. And again, these are cops. These aren't like the Tories' normal base. John Apter, who is currently the chair of the Police Federation, tweeted, Folks, I say this in all sincerity and as an important road safety issue. If you're feeling unwell and your eyesight may be impaired, do not drive your vehicle to test your ability to drive. It's not a wise move. And there was also a now deleted tweet by Surrey Police. Let's get that up. If you have any concerns about your eyesight, don't drive until you've sought the advice of a qualified optician. I mean, have you ever seen in your lifetimes the Conservative Party become such a joke? And I mean, people always say as well, it's fine for you to be hated. I mean, it's an open question whether or not you think this is true, but people say it's fine to be hated. It's not to be ridiculed from a sort of electoral leadership perspective. And at this point in time, there are many people who are like distraught and devastated that they've taken some real sacrifices over the last 10 weeks. And the government has now said, oh, they should have just followed their instinct. There's also people incredibly worried that what they've done in terms of defending Dominic Cummings and rewriting the rules is going to be a huge threat to, the health of all of us. But as well, it's also just a joke, right? I mean, what do you think the Conservative Party are going to be most worried about in terms of, is it them seeming evil or is it them seeming like ridiculous? Dalia.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the worst, what you're saying about it's one thing to be seen as evil, it's another thing to be seen as sort of laughable or ridiculous. That is particularly true when you're in the middle of a public health crisis, because basically, I just think that people are going to very quickly not only lose respect for the instructions and the guidance that the government lays out over the next few months, which is incredibly important. Like, it's very important that the government holds weight and holds respect at a time like this. But also, again, that lack of that lack of trust that they have the wherewithal, that they have the competence to do this, because they don't have the competence to manage this like quite minor, in a sense like a PR crisis that should have been very easy to move on from, has now dragged on to a several day long debacle. So I think, but I also think that this, again, the reason that I wonder what impact this is going to have in the long term is because, once again, this isn't the first time that we have been given, frankly, laughable excuses for massive errors. And I'm thinking back to, the idea that the fact that we missed chances to be part of the EU's ventilator scheme, and we're told that the reason that we missed those chances was because Boris Johnson didn't get the email. So there is this kind of comical sort of level of incompetence that has been running through this entire government. The question is whether, and if so, why this particular crisis will kind of be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Because whilst it is a deeply worrying event, it's not actually as damaging quite yet as something like not being part of the EU's ventilator scheme is, or as the bungling of the care home issue is. But what I think we're seeing maybe is that there has been a willingness to kind of like extend benefit of the doubt and say that, we think that they are making decisions in the best with good faith, and that, this is a complex issue. But at this point, it is just so blatant, and it is just something that should have been so much more simpler than it is, that perhaps we are now looking back at all of those other farcical errors that were made previously that had a much higher a much higher body count, and thinking, actually, if the people making these decisions now were the people making the decisions then clearly this isn't just because it's a very difficult and complex situation, but it's because we have people at the helm of government whose primary goal seems to be playing politics like a game in which they win personal points, rather than being in charge of managing what is a very, very difficult, but also shouldn't actually be this bungled crisis. We should be doing a lot better. And as I said last week, the fact that the plans that are being successfully rolled out in so many other countries that have a much lower death rate was designed by British researchers and British scientists. And yet it is our government that has not had the capacity and the guts and the intelligence to roll it out here.
Owen, I'm not going to throw a question at you. I'm going to give you a video to respond to. This is Michael Gove on LBC yesterday.
Would you go on a 60-mile round trip to test your eyesight?
I have, on occasions in the past, driven with my wife in order to make sure that what's the right way of putting it?
I'm staggered. I don't know how you're going to get out of this one, but it's going to be fun.
No. I think people who know me would know that I'm not an authority on driving, and that I'm not the best person in the world to ask detailed questions about driving.
No, I merely asked you if you've ever been on a 60-mile round trip to test your eyesight, and you said you had. I mean, why not go to Specsavers?
Well, I've subsequently got it. No, the point that I was seeking to make is that I'm not an authority on driving. As someone who took 7 attempts to pass their driving test.
So I mean, we knew that the Conservatives laughed about us in private, but I mean, have you ever seen like that contempt on show to that degree there?
Yeah, I mean, that was a pretty good visual illustration of two fingers being flicked at a nation enduring its biggest calamity since World War II. I mean, I think what's so extraordinary. I mean, you could see what he was doing there. By the way, he tried to kind of indulge the perverse argument made by Dominic Cummings, which I think the polling shows about 8% of the population actually believe is true. I think we can safely say they're cranks. I think there's probably the same proportion who thinks Elvis is still alive. Probably less, actually. But actually, what it does display, and I think this is really important, is it is true with the Conservatives in particular that they should be more worried about being ridiculed and being seen as shambolic, because their selling point always has been, you might think we're nasty, but we're competent. And our opponents might have their heart in the right place, but can you trust them to run the economy, etc., etc.? That's always been their selling point. When they're seen as both nasty and shambolic, that for the Conservatives is the most dangerous place to be in. But I think we need to be careful when we're trying to work out the public mood, because it's definitely true that the government are currently being ridiculed, that their figures are fun. But it is mixed with genuine fury. And I think there were some initially, including on the left, who I think thought the Dominic Cummings saga would be quite a bubble story. It wouldn't necessarily cut through. And I think that misses where the public are at. It reminds me on kind of, but to the nth degree, of the expenses scandal. So the expenses scandal happened in 2009, not long after the financial crash, when the consequences were being felt by lots of people, unemployment and so on. And there was that sense of, I'm struggling. These people are on far higher salaries than me. They're at my expense, putting in these ludicrous claims. If I put in even a much tinier claim at my workplace, I'd be sacked for gross misconduct. And it was that sense of one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. But if you combine that with a deadly pandemic, which has killed tens of thousands of people and led to the deprivation of the most basic freedoms that we have, and to massive economic and social dislocation, and the people at the top who design the rules, they are telling you, you must follow or people will die, and indeed many people have been fined for breaking, that I think is not just ridicule, it is blood-boiling fury. And I wouldn't underestimate that. So yes, to a degree, people are ridiculing these people, but I don't think people saw that clip by Michael Gove and were kind of guffawing at the absurdity of it. Maybe there was an element of that. I think they see that as total and utter contempt at a time when millions of people are going through the biggest sacrifices they've ever made. And I think that sense, there's not, and just quickly on that, the Tories have tapped into this before, the sense of one rule for them, one rule for us. That's what they did with Benefit Ford all that time. They tried to say to struggling low-paid workers, you're struggling, your life's hard. These people down the road are taking the mick. They're not playing by the rules you have to play by, and you're having to sacrifice. And that deflected anger away from bosses and government for cutting their in-work benefits. But that is what this is doing. It's causing real, genuine anger, and it's making the government look shambolic and incompetent.
The public know that what Boris Johnson is saying is bullshit, is a lie. As we've said, we know it's bullshit and a lie. And it seems like Michael Gove even government ministers don't believe what they're saying. One prominent figure recently, made this explicit. Said, "Well, what the Conservative government here are saying is a lie." It was Emily Maitlis on Newsnight last night. She's since got in trouble for this clip. We're going to watch the clip first before talking about the pushback it has received. This is Emily Maitlis on Newsnight yesterday.
Good evening. Dominic Cummings broke the rules. The country can see that, and it shocked the government cannot. The longer ministers and Prime Minister tell us he worked within them, the more angry the response to this scandal is likely to be. He was the man, remember, who always got the public mood, who tagged the lazy label of elite on those who disagreed. He should understand that public mood now, one of fury, contempt and anguish. He made those who struggle to keep to the rules feel like fools and has allowed many more to assume they can now flout them. The Prime Minister knows all this, but despite the resignation of one minister, growing unease from his backbenchers, a dramatic early warning from the polls and a deep national disquiet, Boris Johnson has chosen to ignore it. Tonight we consider what this blind loyalty tells us about the workings of Number 10. We do not expect to be joined by a government minister, but that won't stop us asking the question.
Okay, so that was Emily Maitlis' monologue, which you all heard. I didn't hear, but I did hear it earlier today and, in fact, live last night as well. That got some pushback from various figures on Twitter. And apparently the BBC got a lot of complaints. At 4:30 today, the BBC released this statement. So we can get this up. The BBC must uphold the highest standards of due impartiality in its news output. We reviewed the entirety of last night's Newsnight, including the opening section, and while we believe the programme contained fair, reasonable and rigorous journalism, we feel that we should have done more to make clear the introduction was a summary of the questions we would examine, with all the accompanying evidence in the rest of the programme. As it was, we believe the introduction we broadcast did not meet our standards of due impartiality. Our staff have been reminded of the guidelines. And sort of in response to this, as a small punishment for Emily Maitlis, she has been removed from tonight's episode of Newsnight to be replaced by Katie Razzle. I presume she'll be back tomorrow. I'll start with you, Owen, because I know I've seen from your Twitter feed you have strong feelings about this. What do you think about what's gone on here? The BBC's sort of rush to apologise for what Emily Maitlis said last night.
Well, it's very straightforward what's happened. The BBC have buckled to political pressure from a government which feels cornered and terrified about the fallout of the last few days. My understanding is Downing Street complained directly to BBC bosses, and within hours this happened. Newsnight staff are absolutely furious, as you would probably expect. Look, what was said by Emily Maitlis in that introduction, and I think it is very, very important to make this clear, were just facts. It was facts about public opinion. It's facts where these are things she said about the public mood, which most Conservative voters and most people who voted Leave agree with. Certainly with Conservative voters more than not. And it's not, when we talk about neutrality, and I think we should be very clear about what neutrality means. Neutrality does not mean that when it starts raining, and I say it's raining, and somebody else says, no, it's not raining, treating those as equally valid opinions. It does not include me saying that black is black and someone else saying black is white, and then having a discussion where we can hear both sides of the argument. It doesn't mean, as the BBC have themselves done in the past, incidentally, getting someone who believes the scientific consensus on the climate emergency and a crank who doesn't, and have them fight it out on national radio and let the viewers decide in the marketplace of ideas. It is an objective fact that Dominic Cummings broke the rules. It is an objective fact that the vast majority of the public, regardless of political affiliation, believe that. It is a fact that from The Guardian to the Daily Mail, that is the consensus. The idea that a BBC journalist, who rarely, I'm afraid, speaks in a way which directly contradicts in an uncompromising fashion the government narrative, that is a problem. And I don't want to, solidarity with Emily Maitlis, but let's not forget that a few days ago, she compared the teachers' unions to coronavirus and suggested they had a grip on the political system. No complaints upheld over that. Let's not forget, for example, that if you go back to the early Corbyn period, when Laura Kunnersbergs did a report on Jeremy Corbyn about shoot to kill, the BBC Trust ruled it was inaccurate. The director of BBC News in contravention of what the BBC Trust said, rejected the ruling and defended his journalist, an outstanding journalist and political editor with the utmost integrity and professionalism. What has happened here, let's be very clear, is the BBC have thrown one of their senior journalists under a bus because the government complained and put political pressure on them. We have had as the most senior advisor, someone who was arguably the co-prime minister, who broke the rules that millions of people have had to abide by at huge sacrifice, and a pandemic which has unnecessarily ended in the deaths of tens of thousands of people because of a delayed lockdown when we had record numbers of infections, the failures on PPE, the failures on care homes, and the failures in testing. Finally, we have an apology in this pandemic, not from the government, not from the government's cheerleaders, but from the BBC, because a senior journalist told the truth. And it reminds me of the Iraq War, because what happened then is you got resignations. You got resignation after resignation. Robin Cook resigned. John Denham resigned. Claire Shaw, belatedly. They all resigned from the government in protest of the Iraq War. You had the senior BBC top brass, including the Director General, resigned after a report about the so-called doctored claims on how long it was 45 minutes for Iraqi weapons to hit Britain. You got those resignations, but no one who supported or implemented the decision to invade Iraq had to resign, just the critics. And we're seeing the same all over again, that the people who are responsible for tens of thousands of deaths and have broken their own rules, they don't apologize, they keep their salaries, and the only people who apologize are some rare proper scrutiny from a senior journalist at the BBC. It stinks, and I think the majority of people will see it as such.
Old Statue Face tweeting on the hashtag TiskiSour agrees with you, Owen. They say Dominic Cummings broke the rules. Emily Maitlis punished for calling a spade at a time when our government insists we believe a spade is an eye test. That's quite good too. Dalia, what did you make on this? I mean, I do differ slightly actually with Owen on this one, because I mean, I think I basically agree with what she said, but I do think that the speech she gave was a bit like an MSNBC sort of speech to camera. And I'm not really sure if I want that to be what happens on the BBC, especially the bit that made me sort of a bit uncomfortable was when she said he likes to use the lazy title elite to describe people, because basically that is a political position. That's sort of like anti-populist thing that if she said about Jeremy Corbyn or the left, I'd be pissed off about. And I mean, the thing I completely agree with you, Owen, is that there's a complete inconsistency here when it comes to the BBC, because if she had said that about Jeremy Corbyn, I'm sure there would be no apology. If she had said that, Corbyn uses this lazy word elite to describe bankers or whatever. Or, as you say, if Emily Maitlis says that or compares teachers' unions to a virus, I think, then again, you won't get any apology. You only get an apology when what she has done is failed to show impartiality towards the government. But I do kind of think that she did fail to show impartiality in this case. Dalia, what do you think? Where do you stand here?
Well, the inconsistency is the story, because it tells you that what the BBC is what position within the establishment they currently occupy. And the job of media, the job of a healthy and effective press is not to rattle off press releases from the government. And that is what media and broadcast journalism has become. And that is why, as an industry, it is collapsing. And there is absolutely nothing impartial about the BBC taking direct orders from Number 10. And it is the fact that when they are called out for being biased against, anyone who is anti-establishment in a genuine sense, they position those people who are bringing the criticism as anti-press, as against the freedom of the press, and it's so important for the press to ask the difficult questions. But when it is the other way around, when they are holding the feet to the fire of people who are members of the establishment, and particularly of the Conservative establishment, and I think it's important to understand that the Tories are sort of like the default form of the British state, then that is when we start to see them hide behind this idea of impartiality. That statement made absolutely no sense to me. I didn't understand what they were accusing Emily Maitlis of doing. And as Owen said, you could in a way that you couldn't for the National Union of Teachers issue. You could draw on clear evidence, particularly regarding the fact that the public are not accepting this. You can draw on the polling, you can draw on specific evidence to back up that point. So I think that really, for me, the issue here is that the BBC is picking and choosing when it's impartial and when it is a vehicle of opinion. And the first thing I thought about when this happened, when I saw that Emily Maitlis had been demoted from today's or is being replaced for today's episode of Newsnight, was the fact that during the election, Laura Kuenssberg broke the law when she revealed, and whether that was by accident or deliberately, revealed what the results of the mail-in ballots were. The mail-in votes were, when she said that the Tories had won the mail-in votes. That was breaking the law. That was something that could have absolutely had an impact on the general election. And not only was she not investigated for breaking the law, but we heard absolutely nothing from the BBC. So I don't want to get into this kind of like this discussion about, does this violate impartiality or does this not violate impartiality? Impartiality is a cloak behind which the establishment hides when they are held to, when this fissure between the media and the government is happening. So I think we need to look at this for what it is, which is that the intimate relationship between the Tories and the BBC is the problem here. It's not Emily Maitlis. It's not any of that. It's the point. The question is, when does the BBC hold their presenters to account for impartiality? It's when they go against the ideology and the agenda of the Conservative Party. And it's that power relationship that has been exposed right now. And that has been exposed consistently, particularly when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, because he represented an opposition that was genuinely a threat to their class interests.
Fox, our producer, is just reminding me that the Met Police did in fact clear Laura Kuenssberg of breaking electoral law. But
did they? I mean, we didn't even get an apology from the BBC.
She's definitely committed many more journalistic malpractices than Emily Maitlis, and in more politically significant moments, i.e. in the run-up to an election. For example, when she took as fact that a Labour activist had punched a Tory aide when no such thing happened, and presumably she just got some sort of WhatsApp message about it. We're going to rush quite quickly onto a story about how popularity and opinion polls are changing when it comes to Boris Johnson. First of all, a few comments. Rick Lyons tweets on the hashtag #TiskySour. I sing in a male voice choir in South Wales. Our members are Labour and Tory voters, Remainers and Leavers. We often argue good-naturedly at the pub about politics, yet everyone is outraged about Cummings. Good to hear it. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see. The news cycle is already starting to move on, but I feel like this will remain in the public mind for much longer, because obviously popular consciousness does not move at the same speed as the news cycle. Most of the news cycle gets completely ignored. Joshua Palmer with a super chat of £57.21. Very kind, very exact. Thanks for all the insightful analysis in these trying times. Solidarity to you, Joshua. And Jacob Napper with a tenner. Been supporting Novara for a while now. Corona, Cummings and countless other issues in 2020 politics have proven Novara deserves people's support, the most fact-based quality journalism. Thank you so much, Jacob. I agree. As you know, Novara Media is subscriber funded. If you are already a subscriber, a donor, a regular donor, thank you so much. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Remember to subscribe to our channel. We're going to rush through some new polls, which have shown Boris Johnson's overall popularity dropping. Let's get up this one from Savanta. So it's showing, they do a daily poll, so there's quite a lot of statistical noise here. But you can see there are two big dips very recently. So one is on the 11th of April, where he drops from in the 20s to about 8. And that was after his sort of disastrous, ridiculous Sunday night address, where he sort of said, you've got to stay alert. The lockdown's kind of ending, but it's kind of not. And none of it made any sense. It was all completely unclear. And the second big drop, even more recently, is the over the last 4 days since the the Cummings revelations came out. He dropped 20 points in 4 days, now up a bit. But I mean, to me, that looks like statistical noise. The general direction from this is down. And also we can get up a YouGov poll. So this is feeding into voting intention polls. And YouGov showed there has been the Conservatives are down 4 and Labour are up 5. The Conservatives still ahead on 44% and Labour on 38%. So it seems like this is cutting through. Actually, let's kind of go to Keir, because I think we also had Keir Starmer on that first one. He sort of remained steady, and I think at this point in time he's on exactly the same points as Boris Johnson, but he was above him yesterday. Again, lots of statistical noise here, but you can see Boris Johnson, the direction of his approval is down. The direction of Keir Starmer's is very steady in the low positives. Who wants to go? Is Keir Starmer taking the necessary and the sufficient advantage of this particular situation to prove that he would be a better prime minister than Boris Johnson? He's sort of taken a step back and decided that it's probably best to let the Tories fight amongst themselves, or do you think he should be pushing himself forward more actively as a prime minister in waiting who wouldn't bullshit you to the extent that Boris Johnson has?
Well, I mean, firstly, in terms of his approval rating, let's be honest, most people don't know who Keir Starmer is yet. He's obviously only just become leader last month during a deadly pandemic, which is obviously sucking the oxygen out of everything, including normal politics. So overall, obviously, the collapse in the Tories' ratings is down to their own catastrophic failures. I mean, in terms of Labour's response, I've definitely been in the camp which felt Labour should have come out swinging harder and earlier about the self-evident failures of the government. Like, I understand I'm a gobby lefty. I don't have to make political considerations in the same way that they do. I understand the tightrope of when the majority of people in that syndrome I spoke about of rally around the pilot while the plane is crashing, don't attack the pilot when the plane is crashing. That if you're the leader of the opposition, you have to take that into account. And Labour, were relatively cautious under Jeremy Corbyn in in the dying days of his own administration when it came to the pandemic as well. There was actually some disquiet amongst some of Corbyn's own people because of that. But I think they have certainly been more forceful in the last week and a half, which I think is welcome and needs to be encouraged and nurtured. But I think in terms of Dominic Cummings, I do personally understand the logic that if Labour come out hard, leading the calls for his resignation, that will then stop Tory MPs coming out and calling for him to go, because it will be seen then as a political partisan issue of it's Labour versus the Conservatives on this advisor. And I do probably think that vacating the stage to allow, apparently one Labour figure was asked, who are you putting up for media calls today? And they responded, Michael Gove. So I do understand that. I think there is some logic in that, you allow these absurd, self-destructive media appearances by Tory ministers defending the indefensible rather than making it a partisan blue on red thing. Overall, I would like to see Labour being more assertive, not just about the government's failures, because, I mean, again, public opinion is shifting, but public opinion is not something you should just, ride the waves of. I think the opposition can help shape public opinion, but definitely be more assertive about what comes next in terms of the social and economic policies.
Yeah, I mean, I am less savvy when it comes to, trying to assert what is strategically good when it comes to Westminster politics. I think it makes sense to allow the the Tories to be, to just sort of leave them in this hole that it's impossible to get out of. But for me, I am absolutely disappointed in the fact that we are not seeing a clear, and this is not just from a perspective of what I want to see in the political landscape in the UK, but also because I want to see what Keir Starmer is made of, because I want to know if the Labour Party is something I'm going to vote for in the next election. So I am disappointed that we have not seen more assertiveness in trying to get very key wins. So even if we were to put the Cummings issue aside, I still am absolutely furious and disappointed that Labour did not push on things like rent freezes. I think there are so many different issues here that that the Labour Party could have held the government's feet to the fire, and not just out of, Westminster politicking, but actually to get very concrete wins that would have dramatically improved the lives of people during this time and made them more able to abide by public health advice and therefore keep everyone safe. So for me, that question, separate from the kind of Westminster politicking, that question of have you gotten all of the policy wins that we could have gotten to support people through this crisis? And for me, I haven't seen that yet from Keir Starmer's Labour Party. So that is something that I would definitely like to see more of. And I don't think that the answer is to just step back and let the Conservatives destroy themselves on it, because it's really important to actually make those policy wins right now, especially as this virus is touching people's lives, not just through death and illness, but through kind of economic struggle, which is going to be significant over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, I agree with Dalia. I completely agree on domestic policies. So I share, I think, all of our position, for example, on Labour's failure on rent, private renters in particular. So, I mean, we need to push them to be far more radical on those domestic economic and social policies. I suppose the issue is, I think, in terms of what's happened with Dominic Cummings, it's that old political adage, isn't it? I know it is very Westminstery, but it is never interrupt your opponent when they're making a mistake.
Yeah.
And I think, letting Michael Gove go on air and wrap himself up in knots rather than get bogged down in a Labour versus Michael Gove thing. I'm not of all the things I'm going to criticise Labour for, and I agree with Dalia on that there are things to strongly criticise them on. I think probably this is probably the right call. I mean, they're not making a great success of it, are they?
I agree it's the right call, but there is one thing it relies on, which is that Tory MPs will be brave enough to actually challenge Boris Johnson on this. And I'm personally not convinced. So even though 40 Tory MPs have come out publicly against Cummings, they're mainly backbenchers. Only one minister has resigned. And although his letter was very good, no ministers have followed him. So this was on Tuesday. Let's get up that key passage from his resignation letter. So this is Douglas Ross, who is Minister or the Scotland Office Minister. So he wrote, I have constituents who didn't get to say goodbye to loved ones, families who could not mourn together. I cannot in good faith tell them they were all wrong and one senior advisor to the government was right. Very, very difficult to disagree with that. But still, obviously, the rest of the cabinet have stayed. So I'm sure they all read that and thought, I agree with that. But they don't have the gumption to put their money where their mouth is, where their beliefs are. What we're also seeing is a pattern from Conservative MPs where what they are doing is sort of distancing themselves from what Dominic Cummings has done, but not saying anything strong enough, which would mean that they potentially could face any consequences, right? So one example of this today was Penny Mordaunt, who is a Cabinet Office Minister. She wrote to constituents saying there were inconsistencies in Dominic Cummings' story and that it was all very unfortunate, but she didn't call for his resignation and she's not resigning. We saw a similar message from Sajid Javid, obviously no longer in the cabinet, but a senior Tory. He wrote to his constituents and said, I think Dominic Cummings owes the public an apology, but he called short of calling for his resignation. All of this means that they're trying to distance themselves from the story without really putting their neck on the line. We've also now got a message from, I think while we've been live, Damien Green this evening said, I have expressed my own displeasure and the anger of many of those people who wrote to me, both to the Chief Whip and to Cabinet Ministers. No one at the top of government can be unaware of the widespread public anger at Dominic Cummings' actions. Many of the individual points put in this email to me have been relayed to senior ministers. So, I mean, that's the first time I read that message, but it's very predictable. That's what all these top Tories are basically saying. I've got thousands of emails. I've passed them on. I also think this is regrettable, but unless they unless people are willing to put their money where their mouth is, go up on TV and saying this guy has to resign, otherwise the lockdown's going to be undermined, and the reputation of the Conservative Party is going to be in tatters. Or if cabinet ministers resign, then this opposition is just hot air. Potentially, let's just look at one reason why the opposition from within the Conservative Party might be so. I mean, it's not quite muted, but it's not particularly bold. Is this message? So Danny Kruger, he used to work for Johnson, is a close friend of Cummings. On Tuesday night, so last night, he wrote to Tory MPs to say, this was revealed by Nick Watt from Newsnight, BJ and DC together are why we won the 2019 election, and them together is the only way to GBD, get Brexit done, level up the regions and fix Whitehall. The only thing which will win us the next election. Number 10 won't budge, so calling for DC to go is basically declaring no confidence in PM. So that was said by Danny Kruger, MP, to all new Conservative MPs, basically to say, wind your necks in. Obviously, lots of the new MPs are from, for example, the North East. People in Durham are kind of pissed off that Dominic Cummings brought coronavirus from a coronavirus hotspot, London, to somewhere which had very low levels of coronavirus at that point in time, the North East. So there are some of these MPs in these red wall seats who are feeling a bit under pressure from their constituents. This guy is saying, wind your neck in, because Boris Johnson got you your job, and if you come out too strongly against him, you'll lose it at the next general election. So, I mean, I suppose bravery isn't really what we'd expect from Tory backbenchers, but my worry is that unless we see it from some of them, this story will exit the news cycle. You already saw today that that 5 p.m. press conference, none of the journalists asked explicit questions about Dominic Cummings. They sort of decided, oh, okay, well, they're not going to answer them anyway, so why bother asking? And they basically changed the subject. Do you think there is a risk that this is now over?
Well, I mean, firstly, I'm not surprised about the fold. Look, unfortunately, I think the media are folding. The pattern is, firstly, the Newsnight decision, the BBC's ruling on Newsnight, and secondly, the fact journalists didn't challenge them on it. But the reason so many Tory MPs have, let's be honest, publicly spoken out now against the co-prime minister and damaged their political careers in the process, including members of the 2019 intake who owe their seats partly to Dominic Cummings. The reason they've done that is, first, many people came out and defended him, the MPs, because of that, because they realise you need to stay on the right side of Dominic Cummings for career reasons. Don't mess up. Don't mess about with him for that reason. But then they went and opened their email inbox, and their email inbox was just rage and fury, including by many people who voted for them just a few weeks ago. And in a choice between, am I going to damage my chance of climbing the ministerial ladder, or am I going to lose my seat at the next election? That is why lots of them have spoken out, and privately why so much disquiet is being expressed, which is effectively a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister. So that the fact that well over 40, which wipes out the Tory majority in theory, have called for Dominic Cummings to go, that shows just how serious the public outpouring is. And if we're going to be if we're going to be cynical about it, if we were going to be like, it would be better for Dominic Cummings to stay, wouldn't it? Of course it would. I mean, his remaining there will just be a constant reminder of what he did. This is visceral anger. I don't think this is going to go away. It will shape how everyone saw the pandemic and how everyone saw the government response to the pandemic, and actually the profound inequalities of the pandemic. So I think that will be an abiding memory which will last. It will be seared onto the public consciousness, and Dominic Cummings being there, and the fact the government came out and defended him, and there were no repercussions, will be more fury. It would have been less damaging for the government if he'd been sacked or resigned a few days ago. So personally, in terms of what's right, I think he has to go for a public health reason, because I think it's dangerous, the message this puts across. I think people are going to die because of this, because it's undermined the public health message. That's the point of principle that I want him to go, and that the fact that you reinforce the message that those at the top can behave with impunity and do what they want, that being solidified, because after this, what do you have to do to resign? Like, literally, what do you have to do? But if we were just going to be completely cynical, keep him there. He'll keep damaging the Tories. Latest poll, another poll's just come out whilst we're on air, shows again the Tory lead collapsing. Fine, destroy yourselves. But there's something more important than that at the moment, than that issue. And that is people are going to die because the public health message has been undermined. That is the reason we're calling for him to go. It's against our own partisan interests for him to resign, but it is in the interest of public health for him to go.
Dalia, I mean, I mean, he's basically Cummings has survived, hasn't he? If that was the Tory reputation has taken a hit, it's terrible for our public health. But that guy's going to keep his job.
I mean, I really don't know. I think probably yes. I think if they've held on this far, then I can't see why they would buckle yet, especially as it looks like the press has kind of conceded it and has kind of considered this to be one of those news cycles that have just kind of ended now. But the question is, there is a difference between what the press think. And as we've sort of discussed, there are many things that influence how the press behaves, particularly at this particular moment. But then there is also the question again of, especially if we get another spike in a few weeks or in a month or so, and we can resurface and see that part of this was the fact that people were not abiding by the lockdown, and the fact that the control, the ability to control, the ability to command respect has really been lost, and the public health consequences that's going to have. That is what I think is going to slip away easily. So even though they might feel that the heat has gone off a little bit because the press will back off because of multiple reasons, I do think that lasting impact that it's going to have, and the fact that it is one of the few things that have actually united the British public over the past few years in the political landscape. I don't think that's going to be very easy for the this Conservative government to wriggle out of. And I think we mentioned this last week as well. I am really curious to see what impact this is going to have on two key constituents of the Tory government's win in the last election, which is the elderly, or people with elderly parents in care homes, and also those working class communities in the North and in the Midlands. How are they going to respond to this kind of behaviour, and particularly with some broadcast media piling into that narrative that this is not just an issue of Dominic Cummings, it's a question of how the elite, how the government feels able to behave while we are all making tremendous sacrifices, whether it's restricting our personal liberties or not being able to be with our loved ones as they pass away. That is heartbreaking, and that is going to be only going to touch more and more people. And so as that kind of trauma becomes associated with the particularly like looking at that Michael Gove interview, like it really is, they're just taking us for a mug, really. And I just don't know how the trauma that is going to come out of this, associated with that image of Michael Gove laughing as he tries to get through his talking points, I don't think that's going to be something that we can swallow that easily.
I'm going to go straight to our final story. First of all, we got a super chat from WH with a $5. I really can't afford this, but I want to give it anyway. Novara Media keeps me sane. Everyone on fine form this evening too. Thanks so much, Novara team. Thank you so much, WH. We really genuinely appreciate it, especially if you're struggling for cash at the moment. Our final story is on the new Labour General Secretary. So on Labour's, going to start that again. Yesterday, on Tuesday, Labour's NEC appointed a new General Secretary to replace Jenny Formby. So by a vote of 20-16, so it was pretty close. David Evans, who was an Assistant General Secretary in the Blair years and Starmer's preferred choice for the job, was given the job. He got it. He is controversial among the left because of a report which he authored back in 2001, where he wrote that representative democracy should, as far as possible, be abolished in the party. So prima facie, it seems like this is a bit of a return to New Labour-style top-down management. And some left-wing members of the NEC are not happy. So let's go to this tweet from Rachel Garnham, who is one of the community reps, presumably voted against David Evans for the job. She wrote, "Today, Keir and Angela had the opportunity to prove their commitment to uniting our party. Instead, in their choice of GenSec, so closely aligned to the right of the party, they have shown their pledge to end factionalism to be a sham. Any remaining illusions must now be shattered." Let's go to a tweet now by Gabriel Pogren, which is some news, or the first the first signals we've got from his particular leadership. Right, new. David Evans just hosted a Zoom call for staff alongside Starmer and Rayner. He said Labour must get back to winning elections, wants to professionalise HQ, accepts there's a diversity issue and wants to make it a key indicator of his performance. And then we're going to go actually to the best response to this, which was to say by Stan the Golden Boy, to be fair, Labour should simply win elections marks a significant difference from the General Secretary of 3 years ago who prioritised Labour losing elections. There, a reference to Ian McNicol, the predecessor of Jenny Formby, who, as we know from the Labour leaks, was kind of actively hoping that Labour would lose in 2017, or at least that was the impression we got. I don't want to say anything too categorical that moves beyond what is in that particular document, but that was the strong impression that was given. Owen, how worried should the left be about David Evans?
It's not ideal, if we're going to be brutally honest about it. It underlines why the left's failure to have a united slate in the NEC elections for the 2 by-elections, because, well, 3, but 2 of them have become MPs, including the new MP now for my hometown of Stockport. So you had by-elections, and because there was a split vote, there were 2 separate slates, supposedly of the Labour left, that allowed those on the right of the party to sneak through the middle, which is absolutely critical for what's just happened in this appointment of the General Secretary. It is my understanding that, I mean, it is just the case that Keir Starmer genuinely did want Annalise Midgley to become General Secretary. Annalise Midgley was the Deputy Chief of Staff to Jeremy Corbyn in the first phase of his leadership, and then was political officer at Unite, where now she's just left as a kind of runner-up prize to not becoming General Secretary. Now has a job in Lotto, which I'm glad to see, the Labour Leadership Office. But my understanding is there was internal opposition to that on the basis she worked for Jeremy Corbyn and previously for Ken Livingstone when he was Mayor of London, before obviously he disgraced himself. So that is worrying. It's worrying that there was pushback that was successful there. But David Evans clearly, you know, what Keir Starmer's pitch was to be a unifier and to end factionalism. And obviously it was a concern for many of us when we heard him say an end to factionalism, because, you know, it's like when people say they want an end to the class war. My response to that is, well, fine, but on whose terms do you want that class war to end? And it's sometimes with let's end factionalism, it's like, do you mean on the terms of your faction? Because that would obviously then be hope for unity if all the factions are being smashed. And I worry about David Evans because of comments that he's made, 2 particular comments. One which suggests he's sympathetic to shutting down internal democracy, not ideal, and also goes against Keir Starmer's election pledge to empower members with more democracy. And the other is comments he wrote after the 2010 election, which overtly suggested Labour, in response to UKIP's surge, embrace social conservatism. Now, many members of minorities, myself included, whenever you hear people talk about social conservatism, all you think is, which minority do you want to throw under which bus? And in what order? And in which order? Generally means trans people, and then work your way backwards. So I think, you know, and I'm not saying I don't know his position on trans rights. I should just make that very clear to avoid any complaints being sent in. I don't know the guy. I know very little about him other than those particular interventions, which obviously are of concern. So what he has to do, and Keir, you know, obviously we want to see this from Keir Starmer, who I think has performed, you know, in recent times very well against the government, getting the concession. We wanted to go further on NHS and care workers, migrant NHS and care workers and others no longer have to pay the NHS, surcharge, though we should have that for all migrants in this country. But that was a win. Things like that should be applauded. But, you know, we've always got to remember, and I do this as someone who thinks we need to be critical friends. We need to support the Labour leadership when they get things right, and not be afraid to criticise them when they don't. He did 2 things. He committed to not, to having a broad church, to ensuring that all strands of the Labour Party had a place. That includes us on the left. But he also stood, of course, on 10 pledges, which include hiking taxes on the rich for public investment, scrapping tuition fees, defending migrants' rights, public ownership, no illegal wars. That's his mandate. That's how he wouldn't have won. You know, he won because lots of people who voted for Corbyn twice voted for him, believing he was likely to be electorally the most successful, and because they believed he would stand by those policies. I voted for Becky Long-Bailey knowing she wouldn't win, because I knew that's where people were at. And, you know, I feel, you know, the left itself, it's a tragedy that one of the many failures of the Corbyn project was not preparing for defeat and having any sense of what would come next. So it was just doomed to failure, and Keir was always going to win. He was the most impressive, I suppose, in terms of how he comes across, just because he's a trained lawyer and all the rest of it. And there's a gendered element to that, undoubtedly. But I think, you know, they have to prove that they're going to abide by the democratic mandate. Respect to the mandate means respecting what the mandate was won on, and that was on those policies and uniting the Labour Party. It wasn't won on the basis of the right of the Labour Party clobbering the left, which is obviously what a lot of the right of the Labour Party would do. So let's see what he does, and let's see what he says. But there's no democratic mandate for otherwise. The one thing I just finally end on, though, is there has to be a united left slate for the NEC. The whole NEC, the constituency section of it, is up for election in September. Anyone who's thinking of ripping up their membership cards, if you think by ripping up your membership cards, that's one in the eye for the right of the Labour Party, I'm very sorry to have to say this. There's nothing more they want you to do. Every single person who quits the Labour Party on the left, they will celebrate. They will crack open the champagne. They want you out. They know there's nowhere else for you to go. And I'm afraid that's true. That's how our electoral system works. That's because also the trade union link with the Labour Party. There are these barren sects which are going to go nowhere. There's no shortage of them. And that is just a recipe for self-isolation and marginalisation. Stay in the Labour Party, vote in the NEC elections, and make sure the left win every single place, and make sure there's united left slate. And that will stop the General Secretary being able to do anything which would, and I hope he doesn't do this or want to do this, but to move against the left, which is what we've got to stop.
No ambiguity there. I like it. Dalia, super quickly, because then we've got to wrap up. Your advice to the new General Secretary of the Labour Party.
I mean, I don't think he wants my advice, but one thing for me that is a massive red flag is this framing of what I presume was Jeremy Corbyn's leadership as not prioritizing the winning of elections. I think this idea of we need to go back to winning elections often does not refer to the idea that we need to build a strategy that wins our principles that involve defending migrants, involve defending minorities of all kinds, and also building for socialism. It often means conceding on those issues. So I think for me, that is a bit of a red flag, as well as the background working in the Blair years. But so I think for me, it really is, that is really the litmus test, is are you going to concede on these issues, or are you going to put in the work to build consensus around them? Because at the point that we're in, we're seeing the stark inequality that is underpinning British society right now. We cannot afford to concede on those issues.
Dalia, Owen, you've both been brilliant. Thank you for your time this evening. And thank you, everyone, for your super chats tonight. And for all of our regular donors, thank you so much. You make this show possible. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, because we are going to be back on Friday night at 8 p.m. You've been watching Tisky's Hour on Novara Media. Good night.
Is this the way to Barnard Castle? You see, my vision's a bit of a hassle. Is this the way to Barnard Castle, where sweet Murray waits for me? Sha-la-la-la, load of bullshit. Sha-la-la-la, load of bullshit. Sha-la-la-la, load of bullshit. It was Murray's birthday treat.